In this video, we will take a look at a second type of looping technique which is performed by using what is known as the while loop. Now, the while loop in Python is used to iterate over a block of code as long as the test expression evaluates to true. In other words, while the condition of the while loop is true, then keep executing the code within the while loop's code block until such point when the while loop's expression evaluates to false. So let's think of some real life examples. Imagine you are hungry. You keep eating until you are no longer hungry. Now in Python, this would translate to while hungry equals true, then eat. Now when hungry no longer equals true, then you would want to stop eating. Or while raining equals true, then stay inside. Else, when raining no longer equals true, then you would no longer want to stay inside. Now we generally use the while loop when we don't know the number of items to iterate beforehand. So imagine we have an expression that says, while user wants to play game equals true, then execute the game's code. When user wants to play game evaluates to false, then break out of the game's code. Now we don't know how many times the user will want to play the game. Maybe it's once, twice, 10 times, maybe even 100 times. But it's when the user wants to play game evaluates to false, which would need to be some form of user input, then we want to stop playing the game. So let's see the syntax required for a while loop. So we first of all need to stipulate our condition, and this will determine whether the loop keeps going or not. And whilst this is true, the loop will execute the subsequent statements, and when the while loop's condition becomes false, we break out. So we start by putting the keyword while. We then put a test expression. So I could put here the Boolean value true. This could also be a Boolean variable which contains either true or false, or it could be an expression that evaluates the true or false based on the conditions that you stipulate. We then put a colon. After the colon, we put the statements that we want to execute when the test expression is true. So in the while loop, the test expression is checked first. Now if the expression evaluates to true, the body of the loop is then executed. After one iteration, the test expression is then checked again. If it is true, the body of the while loop will then be executed again. And this process continues until the test expression that we stipulate evaluates to false. In Python, just like we've seen with for loops and conditional statements, the body of the while loop is determined through indentation. So after you press the return key after the colon, you will usually get 4 spaces of indentation, which tells Python that the code body starts here. And then the first unindented line marks the end. So let's see an example. I'm simply going to try to sum the numbers from 1 to 10, this time using a while loop. I'm first of all going to type the keyword while, and then I will follow this with an expression. So I'm going to put I is less than or equal to 10. I'm then going to put a colon. So while I is less than or equal to 10, I would then expect the following code to execute. And because we want to sum the numbers from 1 to 10, I know I'm going to need a total of some kind. So I'm going to create a variable called total, and I'm going to set this equal to 0. In the code body, I can then put my calculation total plus equals I, which means that on each iteration of the while loop, the value that's stored in I will be added to the value that is stored in total. Now we haven't set an initial value for I yet, so we will also set a variable called I and set this equal to 1. Now if I left the code like this, what do you think would happen? Well, I is equal to 1, and our condition is while I is less than or equal to 10, then execute the code block. So we'll just continue running and running the code because I would always be 1. Therefore, the test expression would always evaluate to true. And this would then mean that our code enters into this never-ending loop. And this is known in Python as an infinite loop, which is something you want to avoid. So in order to ensure that our condition at some point evaluates to false, at the bottom of our code, we can also put I plus equals 1, which means that on each iteration of this while loop, I is also going to increment by 1 until the point where I increments to 11, and then the while loop's test expression would evaluate to false, and the subsequent code would stop running. Now if you do find yourself in an infinite loop in Jupyter Notebook, you can come up here to where it says kernel, and then you can click restart. You can then try to fix your code to ensure that you don't run into this infinite loop. So after this code block, I'm simply going to print the value that's stored in total, and when we run this, you can see that we get 55, which is the answer that we're expecting. Now let's see a second example. I'm now going to create a variable called hobbies, and I'm going to store in a list the items sport, music, and coding. Now the while loop I'm going to create now will look to iterate through the items in hobbies and then simply print them to the screen. And we know the way we access elements from a list is via indexing. So I know I'm going to want to print hobbies, square brackets, and then the index value of the item. Now suppose I don't know how many items are in this list. We're going to use the trick of utilizing the built-in len function. So I could put while I, which will represent the index location, is less than the len of hobbies, which we know would be 3 in our example, but that's because we only have a few items to count, which makes sense because a list of 3 elements goes up to index 2. We can then print brackets hobbies, and inside square brackets we can place I. Now we haven't stipulated a value for I yet, so just above the while loop we will set I to be equal to 0, i.e. the first index element. Now because we want the index to increment by 1 each time, after our print statement we can put I plus equals 1. When we run this code, you can see that we print out sport, music, and coding to the screen. Now it doesn't matter how many elements we have in our list, this code will always print the entire list's values. So if we were to add painting, board games, and dancing to our original hobbies list, when we now run this code, you can see that we also print painting, board games, and dancing to the screen. And when I was incremented by 1 to make it equal 6, 6 is no longer less than the length of hobbies, which is 6, and therefore evaluated to false. Because it's evaluated to false, it no longer executed the subsequent code block. So a couple of examples here for you to digest with respect to while loops. Now it's also worth noting that Python interprets any non-zero value as true. A none object and 0 as well as false are all interpreted as false. So let me quickly explain what I mean. If I put if none and then a colon and then try to print hello, you can see that when I run this code, we do not print hello because none is interpreted as false. If I change none to be 0, when I run this code, we still do not print out hello to the screen because 0 is interpreted as false. And obviously if I change this to be false, it will also not print hello to the screen. Now if I change false to be 1 and then run the code, we print hello. If I change 1 to be 2, we print hello. If I change 2 to be a string t, we also print hello because t is a non-zero value and therefore evaluates to true. So also keep this in mind when creating test expressions in while loops. As long as the test expression evaluates to true, the subsequent code block will execute. If it doesn't, it won't.